Hey YouTube, this is PokéCastXVll here and welcome to my very first ever playthrough series on how to play the Final Fantasy trading card game. These will be bite-sized videos in where through watching each video will get you up to speed as to how to play the Final Fantasy TCG. They're aimed at people who have very little or no experience in playing at all and would like more information as to how to get started. First, let's take a look at some brief history as to how the Final Fantasy TCG unfolded. So what is Final Fantasy? The Final Fantasy series stems all the way back to 1987 to its first release on the NES, up to present day, and is a fantasy role-playing game, developed and owned by Square Enix, formerly known as Square or Squaresoft. The franchise leads all the way up to present day, with Final Fantasy XV having just been released. For most of the time, Final Fantasy has adopted the turn-based system game, which has become very popular later down the line with other games and franchises, and in arguably one of its biggest breakthroughs in Final Fantasy VII, moved away from the 2D dimensional graphics. Final Fantasy has featured on multiple consoles in its time, the PS1 being most memorable for a lot of people like myself. In Final Fantasy VIII introduced a new concept in Triple Triad, which was an in-game collectible card game that could be played against other non-playable characters in the game. This game was played on a 3x3 grid and the cards looked a little like this. In 1999, and following the release of Final Fantasy VIII, a set of 110 cards were released for the Triple Triad series. However, this never commercially landed on American or European soil. As of today, the cards have become quite hard to obtain and are seen as more of a collecting hobby rather than actually playing competitively with them. The TCG that we have today was officially released in Japan in late February of 2011. Japan are currently a few sets ahead of us, as we've just had our first set released over here a few months ago in Europe around late October of 2016. Much like the Triple Triads, the game has taken a lot of interest for collectors, as well as competitive players from other TCGs, and of course people who are completely new to TCGs but just love the franchise. The game itself draws a lot of comparisons with Magic the Gathering and Cardfight Vanguard, with a few bits of other TCG mechanics lurking around in there also. But the actual concept of the game is relatively simple to conceptualize, in that you just need to deal 7 damage to your opponent by attacking them directly. In Final Fantasy, you cannot attack your opponents forwards, you can only choose to attack the player, to which they can choose to block with another forward should they decide to, but we'll touch on that later in more detail. Once you've accepted damage, you simply take a card from the top of your deck and place it in the damage zone. Once you've received 7 of these, you immediately lose the game. The game stems from what we refer to as CP, which stands for Crystal Points in abbreviation. There are 3 types of cards in the Final Fantasy TCG: forwards, backups, and summons. All cards can be identified by looking on the middle of the left hand side of the card. All cards adapt the full art style, much like Vanguard and Force of Will, to name a few other TCGs. In the top left hand corner though, you have a crystal which has a number written within it. This demonstrates how many CP you need to put this card into play. To generate CP, you can do this in one of 2 ways: by discarding cards within your hand, or using a backup. Backups will generate you 1 CP, as we'll touch on a bit later. However, by discarding a card from your hand, you will generate 2 CP of that element. For example, if I have a cloud in my hand and I discard it to the break zone, I'll then generate 2 fire crystal points. To play a card, you only need 1 CP of that element, and the rest can be any colour. For example, if I already have 4 water CP and 1 fire, this would meet the requirements for me to play a cost 5 forward like Garland onto the field. Moving on to the top right hand side of the cards, this tells you how many copies of that card you are allowed to have on the field at once. For example, I can have 3 copies of this Black Mage on the field at once, but I can only have 1 Garland. Cards that you can only play 1 at a time are called character cards. The text box beneath you tells you the effect of the card. However, if it has a bold font slightly above the text that says Brave or First Strike, to name a few, this is what's referred to as a special ability, something we'll touch on later down the line. The blue box just parallel to the card on the right hand side simply just tells you what game or generation that card's from. And most importantly, if it's a forward, you have the attack on the bottom right hand corner of the card. This not only acts as a form of attack when you are attacking, but also the card's health as well. So once this reaches 0, the card is then sent to the break zone. Once the forward comes into play, it is unable to attack for that turn unless it has the special ability Haste. All forwards come in active, and when they attack, they are then dulled. An active card is 1 standing facing upwards, whereas a dull card is 1 facing sideways. There are a total of 8 elements, which are fire, ice, wind, earth, lightning, water, light, and dark. The symbol for each element can be found sitting just behind the text box, as well as a colour of the card which helps you identify what element it is. For light and dark cards, they are unable to generate CP when discarded, and you can only have one of that element in play unless the card text suggests otherwise, like Cosmos or Chaos to name a couple. However, you can use any element to generate CP to get them into play. Unlike games like Pokemon, weaknesses in Final Fantasy aren't a factor, so a water card wouldn't have an advantage over, say, a fire card. The last thing to mention is that CP doesn't carry over. By this, I mean if you have generated 4 CP, but only end up using 2 to bring something out, the others would then reset themselves back down to 0. So it's important to be careful when generating CP and not overcompensate when it's not necessary. Moving on, we have backups. Backups do 2 things for you: help you generate CP to prevent you discarding cards from your hand, and also have effects that help you enhance your position. These are quite comparable to land cards in Magic the Gathering. Once you play a backup into play, it comes in dulled, which just means that you can't use it for that turn. Once a backup is active and you want to use it to generate CP, you just simply turn it sideways and dull it, and you would have just generated 1 CP for that element. Specific backups will have effects. Take Yuna for example, which means that each of your water summons will cost 1 less when you go to use them. Or Maria for example, who gives all of your forwards an additional 1000 in attack. Remember to keep an eye on the top right hand corner to see if they're character cards, as you'll only be allowed to have 1 in play at once. Finally, we have summons. These are quite similar to item cards in Pokemon or spell cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! You simply pay their cost and use the effect of that card. Summon cards all do different things. Some allow you to draw more cards, others help you bounce cards and even break or do damage. Once a summon has been used, you simply put it into the break zone. If any card has an EX burst writing in blue font just before the start of the text, it simply means that should it be placed from the top of the deck and straight into the damage zone for damage for your opponent's attacks, you can use the effect of that card immediately without having to pay the cost. And so there you have it, that was a brief introduction into the game and to the cards themselves. Again, these are small bite-sized videos which put together will teach you how to play the game. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you all next time.